From engagement to competitive coexistence, the US and its China challenge. The paper is, and the topic is topical indeed, for various reasons. To discuss the paper, we have a fantastic lineup. We have Professor Alka Acharya, who's Chair, Center for East Asian Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. And we have Ambassador Ashok Kanta, former Ambassador of India to the PRC. We're really fortunate to have two of the leading minds on China today to discuss this paper. So, I mean, the topic itself, I think it couldn't be more topical and timely in the sense that what's happening between the US and China, both from a great power perspective and from internally. I think this paper does a good job to combine some of the internal complications of China. For example, the economic slowdown, issues of reliance, of excessive reliance on export strategy of China, etc. And what does the Biden and the Trump administration do, or the second Trump administration? I think it touches on, the paper touches and leaves it because it was published some time ago. But I think it sets the tone for what is to come really well. And I think the paper is topical for two reasons. One is, of course, from the position of China, where I think it outlines three reasons why, at three frames as to why this is important. One is, of course, the economic slowdown in China, which is being talked about on and off. Sometimes you hear those narratives catching speed, and sometimes they slow down. China. The second is, of course, the unemployment, which is something that we hear very less about from an external perspective. And the third is external pushbacks. And I think that's critical because it is tied to the reliance on excessive reliance on the export-led strategy of China. And the second, I think, is more timely. Why the paper is more timely is because of the impending, or in fact, today there's a second Trump administration is going to take office, and the US-China relations is already taking shape. Trump has announced that he has had a quote-unquote good phone call with Xi Jinping. What does that mean? We are already seeing a gap between the promise of the campaign promise of Donald Trump and the achievability of those factors. For example, you can see a tempering down of the tone in terms of the tariff, for instance, which was being talked about, was hovering around 60%. Now there are talks of about 10%. And I think even within those, there are nuances to which sector Trump chooses to do it. There's the great Elon Musk factor that has come in, which is the business being tied, the business interests being tied to China. And I don't have the numbers, but I think it's well above 50% of production of Elon Musk's Tesla in China. Given those stakes, and given the fact that there's a great degree of influence of Elon Musk in the forthcoming strategy and how it shapes the US-China competition, I think it's important to note that this factor will remain very, very important. And I think the other question is that Biden administration has set in sight a certain tech-related restraint regime, which the paper talks about. What happens to that is a question, again, in front of all of us. Now, critical and emerging technology is a space where I don't see the Congress going back, whether it's Trump or whether it's anybody else, because that's one thing where there is a bipartisan consensus in the Congress, and that's competition with China. But having said that, there is a strong caveat that the US-China competition will take different direction than it was under Biden administration. At least that's my hunch. With that pitch, let me hand over to Dr. Manoj Joshi for the presentation.
I'd like to extend a welcome and a thanks to all the people who are here today. And as Vivek said, the timing purely accidental, but anyway, now we're going to discuss this engagement to competitive coexistence, how the US is managing the China challenge. The purpose of this exercise is to see how the world community can manage China, which has emerged as a major military and economic power. See, you cannot suppress China, you cannot coerce China, but you have to manage. I have first focused on the US-China dynamic, and shortly I hope to publish another issue, brief, dealing with the India-China experience. Now, given China, as I said, there's never been a question of coercing China to follow this or that course. The main challenge has been to manage China's rise, just as today we have to deal with the downturn, which can lead China in what is called the middle income trap, meaning that China gets into the middle income trap and it stays there, stagnates for a long time. That's the possibility. Now, to start with, Western countries in the past viewed China's economic growth in the 1990s as an opportunity for engagement. The rapid growth of China provided increased opportunities for bilateral trade and investment. There was a naive kind of an assessment that despite Tiananmen in 1989, a more prosperous China would evolve and become more democratic. This, of course, coincided with the whole world, the concept of globalization, opening up of trade, reduction of trade barriers. But as the US scholar Jude Blanchett observed in 2024, competition between China and the US is no longer military and economic only. It extends to cyberspace, technological innovation, and even narratives that shape global governance. I won't go into the detail, but you know that China has put forward an entire global security initiative, global development initiative, Belt and Road initiatives, a whole alternate narrative of what the world order should look like. Now, when it came to trade, the West gave China a major leg up by approving its WTO membership without clear-cut commitments on state intervention in the economy and compliance with the IPR. So China got a huge boost at the beginning of this millennium. WTO membership led to an explosive growth of Chinese trade, which rose from 516.4 billion in 2001 to some 4.1 trillion by 2017. China emerged as the largest exporter of goods, world's largest exporter of goods, and a major destination of FDI and a key player in global supply chains. Now it's almost become the player in global supply chains. Now, military power. In this period, China also emerged as a major military power. From 2000 to 2016, China's military budget increased by about 10% per annum. Officially, the Chinese budget in 2022 was around 230 billion, second only to the US. The US is around 700 plus billion. Though experts have felt that this was an understatement by about 60 billion, that it should be much more. And of course, it does need to be pointed out that US has global commitments, so its budget, therefore, is much larger than Chinese, which still views itself as a regional power. In 2020, symbolizing the stupendous growth of Chinese military power, the PLA Navy surpassed the US Navy in terms of the numbers of ships. I deliberately say this numbers of ships, because in many of these areas, the question of numerically, the Chinese may have moved ahead, but the issue of quality, the quality of PLA personnel, their training, their experience, all that, there are question marks before that, and the Chinese know that. The Chinese are fully aware of their limitations. Now, from engagement to competition. So as I said, that the first phase was one of engagement. So everyone said, we are going to engage with China. We want to invest in China. We want Chinese investment. We want Chinese goods. All that happened. But there was a shift began to occur as this millennium came into the 2010s. Actually, 2008 is the point with the great financial crisis when China went up a couple of notches, others came down a few notches. That's the distinct, 2008 is the distinct period then. Now, I just want to skip to the Obama National Security Strategy. So the 2015 National Security Strategy document, and I'm quoting from it, the United States welcomes the rise of a stable, peaceful, prosperous China that delivers benefits to our two people and promotes security and prosperity in Asia and around the world. So you can see an extremely benign statement, even a supportive statement as far as China is concerned. The Obama administration also, of course, as you know, Hillary Clinton said that we would pivot or rebalance to China, to Asia. But when you look at the substance of the pivot, nothing much really happened. There was a lot of talk, there was a lot of debate, there was a lot of discussion. The US remained stuck in Iraq and Afghanistan, down to Biden period. The Afghanistan withdrawal came in 2021. So the US remained stuck there, so it was physically not possible to pivot as was expected. The key trade element of the strategy, of the US pivot strategy, was the economic element, which was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was going to set up higher standards of trade and quality. The incoming Trump administration rejected it. But that was a very important part of the US pivot strategy. Now the Trump shift. So in 2017, the Trump National Security Strategy spoke about how Russia and China were challenging American power and attempting to erode American security and prosperity. So a very different, very distinct shift of tone has taken place. Contrary to our hopes, China expanded its power at the expense of the sovereignty of others. And the US would therefore work with allies to contest China's unfair trade practices and trade and economic practices and the acquisition of sensitive technologies. It's only when at this point, meaning in the Trump administration 2017, that this shift occurs. And the shift then becomes fairly dramatic. The Trump NSS said the US would prevent unfavorable shift in the various regional balances of power. And under the Build Act of 2018, the US put $60 billion into the International Development Finance Corporation. This was a new corporation they set up to compete with the BRI. So it was at about this time that the US parts of the US already knew that the Chinese had used all kinds of strategies with regard to technology acquisition. Companies were forced to part with technology. There was stealing of technology, very clearly this thing. And there was open acquisition of technology. One of the world's biggest robotics company was bought from Germany by the Chinese. And it's only then that the Germans woke up, when this company was bought by the Chinese, that something is happening. And so only by the end of the 2010s, in 2020 or so, that this kind of awareness arose in both Europe and the United States, that they've been had. Simple as that. Now, Trump also revived the Quad in 2017. And in 2019, during the Trump administration, it was elevated to the level of a ministerial dialogue. That means foreign ministers, prior to that, it was just kind of an officials met. The US Pacific Command was renamed into the Indo-Pacific Command, the US Indo-Pacific Command. So this is a very significant development. Basically, what the US said, what really happened was that as long as there was, the US described this area as Asia Pacific. For long, long years, as a scholar, I've seen the US limited limited Asia Pacific to Southeast Asia. That is, Asia Pacific was between the US West Coast and Southeast Asia. It's only when they said Indo-Pacific, they got India in. So what happened was that as long as it was Asia Pacific, China was looming very large. When you stretched it out to include India, then you could balance China. So it's a very simple kind of a geographical explanation for the rise of the Indo-Pacific strategy. Now, as I said, the TPP walkout undermined the trade element of that pivot strategy. The Trump administration sanctioned Huawei and blocked foreign companies from supplying Huawei and other with critical components, and other companies blacklisted on account of security. So this was the beginning. Huawei was the biggest challenge, because what happened? What was Huawei? Huawei had taken a technological leap and created 5G, had become the dominant player in the 5G, and was threatening to swamp the world with its technology. And this is the point in time when the Americans drew a line. Because you're talking of 5G technology, routers, equipment, telephone equipment, etc. All of that would be accessible to the Chinese. And so the US drew a line and literally pushed coerced its allies into following suit. Now comes the Biden administration. Under Biden, on one hand, the US emphasized that it was in a competitive relationship with China. On the other, it sought engagement to establish guardrails to prevent competition from getting out of hand. So this was a distinct shift. The Biden strategy, all the Trump tariffs were continued, all the Trump trade technology restrictions were continued. Only thing is that Biden emphasized diplomacy. He emphasized diplomacy at two levels. One was that he opened out to US allies who Trump looked down on. Japan, South Korea, Philippines, even European allies. The Trump was quite disdainful about them, but Biden reached out to them. And so the Indo-Pacific strategy actually became, the Indo-Pacific of the United States became more solid as a result, you see. So he stressed multilateralism to counter China. The Secretary of State Blinken said in May 2022 that China was unlikely to alter its trajectory. So the US had to shape that trajectory. So Biden's national security strategy was much more explicit in viewing China as a strategic competitor. They said China, so they were quite clear from the whole engagement period in Obama's time. Suddenly we come to the point where China now saying we have strategic competition going on with China. And all in a matter of 5-6 years. China, the US NSS said, was the most consequential geopolitical challenge to the US. The PRC is the only competitor with both the intent to reshape the international order and, increasingly, the diplomatic, military, and technological power to do it. So the Biden administration also continued with a progressive ban on chip exports, which were aimed not just on the issue of security, but actually to check China's development as an economic power. So the US became much more forward on this. It said, security has often been cited as the reason why the US took various steps. But they also privately became quite clear that they wanted to dampen the surge of Chinese capacity. The US persuaded key allies like Japan and the Netherlands to restrict technology relating to artificial intelligence chips from reaching China. NSA Jake Sullivan spoke of the US policy being a small yard with a high fence, whose goals were primarily driven by security. But as I said, that's not really true. The goals eventually became that the US was afraid of China's surge of technology in the so-called Made in China strategy, which had been adapted in 2015. Actually, if you go back, and that's not the purpose of this exercise, right from the outset, the Chinese had this strategy of Made in China, trying to get all key technology areas within Chinese auspices in China. It's only in 2015 it became a little bit more open. To this end, they also literally bought up technology or stole it. They also did another remarkable thing, which again, they don't speak much about today, which is that they had this so-called 1,000 Talents program, under which they bought talent from all over the world. So if you were an American professor who had not got tenure, you would suddenly have an offer from China. And you would get an offer, a very generous offer. So very key individuals started working in China, and they helped the development of Chinese technology. US also, another aspect of the Biden strategy was to encourage the revival of US industry, particularly in strategic areas like semiconductors. CHIPS and Science Act provided $52 billion to subsidize chip manufacture. Inflation Reduction Act allocated a whole lot of money for green energy, energy security, climate change initiatives. The policy also integrated national security with economic strategy by recognizing that domestic industrial capacity is important for economic resilience and geopolitical strength. Now, this part of it actually was injected by the COVID experience. When suddenly you found that the Chinese were blocking certain supplies, the Europeans were blocking certain supplies, the Americans were blocking certain supplies, it was each man for himself at that point. So they said that you must have economic resilience. For geopolitical strength, you needed economic resilience, and you needed certain critical industries near home or at home. So part of this, the Indo-Pacific security architecture that the Biden administration created was to build on it was built on the Trump initiatives in the Indo-Pacific. I told you that Trump had revived the Quad. Biden hosted the first virtual summit meeting of the leaders of the Quad in March 2021. That's within months of becoming president. He became president in January 2021. So in March, he had the virtual meeting of the Quad. And then they had an in-person meeting in September that year. In February 22, the US Indo-Pacific strategy was formally put out, emphasizing the importance of collaboration with regional allies, as well as talking of a new security framework of AUKUS, that is Australia, UK, US. Now, this was an important part because the Quad, countries like India were hesitant to allow Quad to become any kind of a military alliance. So because of that, the US decided that they would rely on their traditional allies. The traditional allies are Australia and the United Kingdom. So they created this AUKUS. Of course, ostensibly, this is about supplying nuclear-propelled submarine technology to Australia, but it's really a military alliance, which also looks beyond many of these areas and looks also into emerging technologies. The US also established a comprehensive strategic partnership with the ASEAN. It created an Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, IPEF, to promote healthcare, high labor, and environment standards, and enhance supply chain resilience and fair business practices. Now, IPEF was a poor response to the TPP, meaning because the TPP had been, the US public no longer supported the idea of a TPP. The US public doesn't want any kind of trade agreements with anyone, because they realize they are the biggest market. People will come to them. People like Trump say, they will come to us, we will charge whatever tariffs we want. So IPEF is a kind of a poor cousin of that, of the TPP. But you needed an economic component, meaning you can't have just a military or a geopolitical component, geopolitical organization like Quad or a military alliance like AUKUS and have no economic component. So the IPEF serves that purpose. So as I said, the Indo-Pacific security architecture involved an upgrade of the Quad, creation of the AUKUS, as well as, very importantly, the US, Japan, South Korea trilateral, and the US, Japan, Philippines trilateral. So the US used to earlier have what is called hub and spoke alliances. That US was the hub, and it was linked to Japan, Australia, Korea in spokes. But now they are increasingly, they decided to make it into trilateral. And eventually they might make it into a bigger alliance, meaning people have been speaking of an Asian NATO and whatnot. The US also hosted, the EU partners started aligning with the Indo-Pacific thing. So you've had Germany, you've had France, Netherlands, talk of a US, EU presence in the Indo-Pacific. The US hosted 2 Pacific Island forums. Now, this is very important because while attention was elsewhere in Australia's own neighborhood. Australia used to think that it is the big dada in the South Pacific area, but the Chinese started making inroads there. And so the US suddenly woke up and they started wooing the South Pacific nations. New defense pacts were signed with Papua New Guinea and Fiji. Maritime domain awareness projects, in which India is also involved, were initiated. Basically, the idea is to protect the fisheries against rogue fleets that mainly coming from China, rogue fishing fleets. Now, what is the Chinese response? The Chinese played it quite cool. Summed up by Wang Yi to Blinken last September, he complained the US should not always approach China with two faces. On the one hand, encircling and suppressing China brazenly, and on the other, having a dialogue and cooperation with China as if nothing is wrong. So this was Wang Yi's complaint. China, of course, also played hardball. China implemented its own export bans on critical minerals like gallium and germanium. China is also undertaking a long-term strategy to reduce dependence on foreign technology, which seeks to position China as a world leader in emerging technologies. This is what I told you. This is something which has been there right from the beginning of the Chinese industrialization. It is only being noticed now that the Chinese have ensured that in all key areas they want to have autonomy. Now, currently, Chinese exports straddle both low and high-tech areas. You see, we thought that if the Chinese go up to the high-tech areas, they will shed the low-tech areas to Vietnam, Malaysia, India. That's not happening. The Chinese are retaining both the high-tech areas as well as the low-tech areas. Low-tech meaning what? Toys, furniture, etc. But a lot of money there. Now, looking to the second Trump era. Now, this, because this paper was written much earlier, there'll be a little bit of difference in what was written there and what I'm speaking now. Now, Biden to Trump 2, Biden, as I said, had largely built on the Trump approach, but he emphasized the importance of allies and multilateralism. This was an important aspect of Biden's policy. Allies and multilateralism, whereas Trump disdained all of them. He asked South Korea and Japan to pay up for their protection. He told Taiwan that we'll agree to, you pay for your protection. The basics of both are the same, meaning the Biden and Trump approach are the same. They share a foundational approach characterized by the need to contain and compete with China. So there's no difference there. Both, in that sense, there is a consensus in the United States that we need to contain and compete with China. Tariffs have been used by both Biden and Trump, to deal with unfair Chinese trade practices. Both have focused on national security as a driving consideration in their policy towards China. Biden has sought to set the future course for Trump by tightening US restrictions on chips relating to AI, which he has done just last month. In September 2024, the US rolled out new exports, controls over quantum computers and components, advanced chip-making tools, etc., all of which had to do with AI. Earlier this month, the US imposed some of its strongest measures to limit Chinese advances in AI. The rules impose caps on how many advanced chips can be exported to certain countries. And unfortunately, India is not on the list. There are some 18 countries to which advanced AI chips can be exported. Meanwhile, China has continued its trade policy, but Chinese trade policy, the Chinese export machinery carries on. And this year, 2024, their surplus reached $1 trillion. Decoupling or de-risking has not worked. These were the words that were used earlier. They were going to decouple from China. We're going to de-risk from China. It didn't work. Now, the Trump change, what could happen? Trump policies could revert to their unilateral and confrontational style. Biden rhetoric, which spoke of de-risking instead of decoupling, went out of its way to engage China, the new Trump team could be less accommodating and could well move onto the path of decoupling, meaning that's possible. But there's more nuance to it, which I'll explain. Trump views the central challenge of his administration as to recovering its geo-economic dominance in the global system. That's the Trump thing, that how does US recover its geo-economic dominance in the global system? Geopolitically, the US remains the strongest. It's the geo-economic part of it which is a problem. So to this end, his main goal will be the geo-economic containment of China. Now, what is the future? China is the third largest US trade partner and exported 524 billion last year to the US, 5% more than 2023. And its trade surplus was 361 billion with the US. China is the dominant supplier for many US imports, including 75% of the toys and sports equipment, 25% of electronics and electrical machinery and textiles and clothes, and 20% of plastics and rubber. Sellers will simply, what the sellers will do when we talk of 10%, 50%, 60% tariffs, they'll simply pass on the tariffs to the consumers. So what's going to happen? There will be inflation in the US. China is prepared for trade war, and its new strategy will be more aggressive in exploiting supply chain vulnerabilities, such as those in the area of drones. China is the dominant producer of drones. It will also attack US companies, and it's already done so. It's doing, it has called in Intel, Micron, NVIDIA for inspection, examination, etc. All kinds of strategies to basically harass them. See, but many of these companies, now I don't know how much of this is visible, because I had to copy this off some. Basically, what I'm trying to show is that if you look at this, this is 2030, this is 2025. This. So in these areas, unmanned aerial vehicles, solar panels, graphene, high-speed rail, and electrical vehicles, China is already the world leader. So in 2024, they're already the world leader in those areas. The yellow part, the yellow dots, the Chinese are competitive. Here today, 2025, China is already competitive in these areas. What are these areas? LNG carriers, drugs, large tractors, machine tools, robots, artificial intelligence, semiconductors, and only one area in which they are still behind is commercial aircraft. Which is this red out here, is commercial aircraft. And this, we know that China has just flown this, what is the name of the aircraft, the Comac 119, I think that is the thing, which they have just flown it, which they have positioned to compete with the Boeing 737. The Chinese strategy on commercial aircraft went haywire because in the 1990s, they chose a US company, McDonnell Douglas, which actually sank. So they had chosen McDonnell Douglas to target its technology. Unfortunately, that for the Chinese, that company sank, and they couldn't go very far with that. So this is the Chinese growing clout, and these figures are from Bloomberg, magazine. These are not my figures, but so you can see that the Chinese are already world-class or world leaders in a range of technologies. So it's not a very simple issue of simply tariffs and embargoes. So what about the US-China deal? Now, everyone knows Trump is notoriously transactional. Now, you recall in January 2020, the US and China signed a phase 1 deal to end their tariff war. Not many people remember that, but the US and China actually had a deal with the Trump administration to end the tariff war. Trump emphasized military support through cost sharing, but not independence for Taiwan. I'm giving you this thing. One is the issue of the trade deal. Second is the issue of Taiwan. His commitment to defend it against Chinese attack remains uncertain. Considerable business support for normal ties with China. There is, within the US, there's a lot of resistance. Companies like Tesla, Nvidia, Apple, Starbucks, McDonald's have big stakes there. Trump's posture will depend on many factors, including the economic condition and political lay of the land in the US. So I'm saying that instead of rushing into something, I don't anticipate that. I think Trump will very carefully calculate his posture, depending on the lay of the land. And as I said, that if you just simply put tariffs, that's going to trigger off inflation. And the middle class that's been supporting him will ditch him. Now, Trump and Xi. During his first term, Trump initiated a trade war against China. He cracked down on Huawei and sharply attacked Beijing for COVID. Now, Trump has vowed to increase tariffs between 10 and 60%, as well as tough restrictions on Chinese investments in the US. Now, he has bipartisan support for both these policies. But what can we make of Trump's invitation to Xi to attend his inaugural? Or last Friday, his phone call when with Xi Jinping, they discussed the issue of trade balance, fentanyl crisis, TikTok, and future collaboration. All these subjects were discussed. On Sunday, that is yesterday, the Wall Street Journal reported that Trump wants to travel to China in the first 100 days of office to deepen relations. So this is very contrarian to what we have been hearing so far. So Trump too, let's be very clear about one thing. Trump too will not be the same as his first term. See, in his first term, he appointed a cabinet of generals, businessmen, mainstream Republicans. This time, the emphasis on loyalty. So we know that people like Marco Rubio or Mike Waltz, the NSA, or Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, are China hawks. We know that. But they can be what they want. At the end of the day, it is Trump who's going to decide. And that was the purpose, because last time, if you remember, in his first term, he had to keep on changing. He changed his Secretary of State. He changed his National Security Advisor. Because he was just not satisfied. He felt that they were not being loyal to him. And so loyalty is the criteria. And his actions, what I've just outlined to you on China, seem to suggest that he intends to lead from the front when it comes to the Chinese policy. Of course, the point is, with its economic problems, where he leads is an issue. With its economic problems, Beijing has incentive to engage the US, and the summit could jumpstart policies. See, there are a number of proposals which I put up here. Many of these were discussed in the Phase 1 trade deal. Many of these were taken up in the Phase 1 trade deal, agricultural purchases, IPR protections, access to financial markets, access to markets. These were all part of the the Phase 1 trade deal which Trump had already signed. So what do I see as the end game? Broadly, there are two schools of thought in US on China. Both believe that the Communist Party of China wants the PRC to become the #1 global power. The first school, that rivalry will persist as long as CPC rules China, and competition should be aimed at regime collapse. So we must try and collapse the regime headed by the Communist Party of China. The second school of thought is the one which says that the future is one of competitive coexistence. The US will have to shape Chinese behavior through a mix of incentives while relying on pressure and dissuasion. In my view, given its technological and military capacity, China cannot be easily bested. Competitive coexistence is the future. That's my perspective. China may be at a point where US restrictions may have the paradoxical, because what could happen is you put more restrictions on China, that gives incentive to China and Chinese companies to innovate. And the Chinese, by all accounts, you can read any specialized study on this, will tell you that there are many areas which the Chinese have been innovating and they have been doing pretty well. AI, for example, is one of them. And so restrictions may have the paradoxical consequence of actually encouraging China to move ahead. So that's the end. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. That was a fascinating, comprehensive set of points put across in this paper. Much water has, I totally agree, much water has flown under the bridge since the Trump 1.0. We have different set of circumstances. But I also tend to agree with Manoj sir on the point that I think geo-economic agenda is going to rule at the helm for the Trump 2.0. And how that pans out, I mean, there are various things on the table, like a possible Greenland deal, etc. How that unravels remains to be seen. But without much ado, let me now invite Professor Alka Acharya for her comments. Ma'am.
Thank you all for being here to listen to this absolutely gripping narrative that was just unfolded before us. Now, with 10 minutes at my disposal, I do not think I can engage with this argument and narrative in any kind of detail. So therefore, I will approach this whole theme of the US and its China challenge within this frame that Manoj has outlined, engagement to competitive coexistence, from the perspective of the academic issues that emerge from this. We have all been watching the Sino-American dynamics ever since World War II, and then the first frame, which was containment, which transformed over a period of time by the turn of the century to engagement. Early on, coinciding with 9/11, we started to hear the term congagement. Now we have come to this frame of competitive coexistence. Now, let me just make my fundamental arguments first, and then I shall unfold them, that I'm basically making two sets of propositions here. The first is that this concept of competitive coexistence comes up against a somewhat problematic paradox, which we see reflected in the US foreign policy, which is that the competitive pertains to the economic sphere, whereas the coexistence appears to be to somewhat engage in the multilateral or the political strategic sphere. And my argument is that this contradiction cannot promise a sustained coexistence as long as there is this undercurrent of competitive economics. Towards the end, Manoj concluded by saying that there's no question that the US wants to retain its geopolitical dominance. And my submission here is that this geopolitical dominance cannot be built on this paradox of economic disengagement, decoupling, de-risking, but trying to coexist in certain kind of strategic or political spheres, if you will. Now, underpinning this argument basically is the entire debate in IR since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the bipolar world, that we were entering into an era of structural transformation of international relations. And how this structural changes that were heralded by the collapse of the Soviet Union, emergence of Russia, and so on, how this, and then of course, at a somewhat subsequent period, we begin to hear about the rise of China, then we hear BRICS, and then we, of course, let's go back and say that towards the last quarter of the 20th century, already the talk about the shift of the center of gravity of IR to Asia had begun. So the structural transformation that we are trying to understand is not just about the last 10 years of sudden emergence of China as the chief strategic competitor of the United States, but a larger structural transformation dating from the collapse of the bipolar order the deepening of economic globalization, and now, of course, the specter of power transition, or how is this contest between the two major powers in the world going to end? So essentially, we are saying that competitive coexistence, if we sort of keep this in the background, competitive coexistence is the US response to these structural changes. And I'm not too sure whether this is a strategic response or a tactical response. Because if we are looking at a strategic response, we cannot take the position that if the United States feels that the Chinese are gaining on them, then coexistence will come to an end. In other words, the chief problem is still, how is this structure going to emerge as China acquires the #1 position, which, all things considered, it is moving steadily towards. Okay, so that's the first argument that I am building. And the second problem that I see in this framework of competitive coexistence is that both the competition and the coexistence are now being shaped by very, very complex set of factors. Each of them are now responding to very different kinds of forces, which are, in one sense, an outcome of the rise of China, the changes as a consequence of deepening globalization, and the shift in the way in which multilateral platforms, so Manoj again referred to the fact that the US responded by thinking in terms of trilaterals or minilaterals or plurilaterals. So the entire multilateral framework itself is undergoing a kind of a transition, if you will. These are the basic two arguments, and I'm just going to take the next 5 minutes to just explicate on both these arguments very briefly. Now, I am starting with again, another proposition, which is contestable, of course, that we are witnessing the emergence of China, in a sense, emergence of a China which is increasingly finding it able and increasing its capability to challenge the US on a variety of fronts. And Manoj's graphic easily tells us where they are the world leaders, where they are putting a stiff challenge. The ability of China to challenge the United States on a large number of fronts, economic, technological, I dare say diplomatic also, if we open up the arena and move into the non-Western world, where China is indeed putting up a stiff challenge. What are the factors on which I base this assessment? Number one, change in the share of global GDP in PPP terms. And today, of course, you have GDP constituting a very important underpinning of the national power of a country. US share of global GDP at the heyday in the 1950s, 50% of the world GDP, is now down to 14% in 2018. And China has just recently surpassed the US in terms of global GDP. It is now 18% of the global GDP. Secondly, as a near peer competitor, we see the Chinese ability, unlike the earlier peer competitor, which was the Soviet Union, unlike that, the Chinese are positioned very, very differently in this contest between the US and a kind of a peer competitor. It is very deeply integrated into the world economy. Larger number of countries are dealing with China. Forget the blowback, pushback, contestation problems. Those obviously exist. It is very strongly intertwined with the American economy. It is, unlike the Soviet Union, also now capable of turning this economic advantage into very strong strategic influence. And that's the big difference. It is the top trading partner for more than 2/3 of the world's nation. The level of exchanges at the P2P level, which talks about technological linkages or tourist flows or student flows or a variety of other kind of interactions at the P2P level, shows that even at the level of society, there is a far greater kind of a interface between China and this in the United States. So how does this competitive coexistence, given this kind of a picture, play out in the backdrop of a China which is set to become, or at least is determined, as announced, directly or indirectly, of its intention to become number one? And here, of course, we'll come to the last 3 points about Trump, the transaction man, Trump, the deal maker, the great bargain of which we've been hearing a lot. There's another problem here, which is the perception problem. And I think here we need to understand this emerging competition from the perception issue, which is that Trump 01, Biden, and now Trump 02 has displayed a certain erratic kind of a posture in its foreign policy. And there is no doubt that there was a great deal of angst amongst not just its friends, but also its allies in terms of where exactly, how predictable was the US foreign policy, who is aligned with whom. These boundaries are getting very, very increasingly blurred. And in any discussion on China-EU, you will see how difficult it is to maneuver the discussion into any clear-cut kind of groups and so on. So my final argument that structural changes, and therefore the choices that are sought to be made, will need to factor in the strategic goal of the United States. And that has already has been stated, and I have no difficulty in upholding that, to stay number one, to uphold its geopolitical dominance. And the rise of China is going to increasingly go against this objective, strategic objective of the United States. In fact, fears of losing this competitive edge within the US has led to a variety of policies. I do not have time, I have to conclude. So finally, therefore, how do we see this? Two ways. One is that the competitive coexistence collapses as and when the Americans come up against a problem that they are not able to resolve. And so they use other means or pragmatism. So the grand bargain, we heard this grand bargain in Trump 01 as well. We are talking about the art of the deal. But, over and above, I think we should go back to the Trump 01. Biden period was very well put, has seen a lot of continuity with Trump 01. So clearly, with minor changes, we will see a continuity. I'm reminded of this joke that read somewhere that President Nyerere of Tanzania was accused by the US of trying to establish a one-party dominance. And he responded by saying, well, the Americans also have one party, but in typical American extravagance, they have two of them. So the point here is that at this particular stage, we are seeing a kind of a consensus, bipartisan consensus. And therefore, we will find that the pragmatism that, and Trump said the most horrendous things, he tweeted the most horrendous things, he accused the Chinese of just about everything, and yet we see bargaining, we see a reduction in tariffs, So I'm basically concluding here by saying that clearly competitive coexistence cannot be the framework, because either the competition is going to get so intense that the coexistence will become impossible, or the coexistence will force concessions, which will then conflict with the larger strategic objective that the Americans have. I'll conclude.
Thank you for providing a theoretical frame to the structural upending, I would say, that is unfolding between China and the US, and will continue for some time to go. We are running out of time, so straight away I want to invite Ambassador Kanta for his comments. I do want to make sure that there is enough engagement of the audience. So,
Sorry,
no,
I
please.
snatched your mic. Well, thank you, Vivek. Let me begin by saying that actually I agree with most of the findings in Manoj's paper, so I don't wish to dwell upon that. I'll reiterate one point that Manoj has made. That is how the US strategic perception of China as a challenge, as a threat, evolved from Obama administration to Trump administration and how it continued during Biden administration. And here I think the best documents to look upon is what he referred to, National Security Strategy of 2015, 2017, and 2022. He has already talked about it, so I'll not reiterate that point. But short point is that Trump, in his own chaotic way, uh, said something which was sitting right in front of us, that the emperor has no clothes. So he named China. He called out this highly mistaken notion, which frankly, people in India never believed in, that there will be transition of China into a sort of liberal polity, a sort of responsible stakeholder in a US-led world order. Anyone who's paying attention to what Xi Jinping was saying, not only the actions, wouldn't have arrived at such a conclusion. So the Rubicon has been crossed. So that's behind us. I don't think we are going to go back to a period where the USA and China will seek engagement in a manner they did until Obama presidency, when a very half-hearted attempt was made to pivot towards Asia, which was quickly redesignated, rebalancing to Asia. They were so worried about Chinese reaction. But when we talk to our Chinese interlocutors, and I've been meeting them quite often since I've been to China quite a few times in the last year and a half, there is a clear consensus among all of them that USA wishes to contain and suppress China, not only in military terms, but in terms of its development, in terms of meeting its objective as emerging as an advanced country. And this has been stated publicly by Xi Jinping in a very unusual comment. Normally, he doesn't say that publicly, in March 2023 on the margins of National People's Congress, when he said that the US-led West is seeking to contain and suppress China. In so many words, he stated that, and that hasn't changed. That policy has continued, as Manoj mentioned. Trump policy continued with some changes during Biden administration. This aspect of working with allies, I have somewhat different take. Actually, Trump also worked with allies. You don't go by his rhetoric. You go by what he did in practice. He didn't rake up, NATO. He didn't actually walk out of Article 5 commitment. He had a different way of doing things, or putting pressure. I suspect that will remain relevant today also. So USA is not running the risk of quickly, sort of leaving behind allies and partners. I don't quite buy into that. What we have seen, just stepping a little bit, since the middle of 2023, after the balloon incident, there was, concern on both sides that we are running towards a situation might lead into conflict. And there were several rounds of closed door discussions, especially between Jake Sullivan and Wang Yi, at multiple occasions. At that time, they were not fully acknowledged, which led to what Biden described as a construct of managed competition. Chinese never accepted the construct in terms of framework, but they went along with it. So essentially, it means that we'll continue to compete, but let's see if we can keep the relations stable. By and large, that has worked. And this is not something peculiar to China's relations with USA. In fact, since middle of 2023, we have seen a tactical outreach by China towards EU, Japan, Australia, Vietnam, and to much lesser degree India in recent months. So it's tactical because China's strategic objectives of emerging as the preeminent power in Indo-Pacific and eventually globally hasn't changed. You just need to look at Xi Jinping's work report at 20th Party Congress in October 2022. So it's those objectives remain unchanged. There was this interview by outgoing US Ambassador to China, Nick Burns, long interview he gave to Foreign Affairs. He said that during his tenure, which was relatively long tenure, 80% of work was on competition, 20% on cooperation. So they make no bones about it. This was a formal official interview while he was still ambassador. He had not stepped down yet. As Manoj brought out, while US has sought managed competition, has sought stability in relations with China, and China has reciprocated reasons Manoj has given, its own geopolitical predicament, economic difficulties, etc., etc. It has actually softened its so-called wolf warrior diplomacy quite a bit in last year and a half. The US attempt to slow down growth of China, especially in high-tech arena, has actually stepped up. It has been stepped up. Just look at what Biden has done in last 1 month. I'll not go into detail, but number of steps which have been taken to reinforce export denial regime applicable to China is quite impressive. And as Manoj mentioned, it's no longer just small yard, tall fence. Actually, yard is becoming larger and larger, and it's not just limited to security. It's more a question of retaining US technological edge, especially in artificial intelligence, quantum computing and application, and semiconductors, advanced semiconductors. And USA is working with allies fairly closely in those areas. But at the same time, China has also taken last 4 years kind of ground China has covered in terms of technical innovation, and Manoj is not just stealing. Actually, they have put in a lot of effort. Huge amounts of money have been invested in catching up in frontier areas of technology. And as Manoj brought out, in many areas, actually, they are ahead of the West now. Green energy is just one area. In fact, you have a situation today where 60% of global output of EVs, where they were not a major player 5 years ago, accounted for by China. 80% global output of solar panels accounted and wafers accounted for by China. 95% of equipment required for manufacturing wafers accounted for China. I can give you the list. It's a fairly long list. And they have actually gained a lead, an edge, which is virtually insurmountable at this point of time. And there is a very real concern among Western countries that unless there is a robust response to China in high-tech manufacturing, and Xi Jinping talks about 3 new, electric vehicles, lithium-ion battery, and solar panels. But he has other, areas in mind. There'll be retarded industrialization in Western countries and in emerging market economies like India. And this is a real threat, what is being referred to as China Shock 2.0. Now, coming to Trump administration, we are all aware of what he has been saying. We are aware of people he has appointed as part of his incoming cabinet. But I'll fully agree with Manoj that in second Trump administration, don't go by views of his cabinet members, because one person who really counts is Trump alone. And, and now he's experienced, he knows how to work the system, and he has certain objective. Don't go by, what he says or what he pretends, but he has certain objectives in mind. Whether or not he will impose tariff to the extent he has talked about, we don't know. We'll know in a couple of days' time. But one thing is clear, that he is not entirely following the script of his campaign rhetoric. You just go by what he has done in last few days, inviting Xi Jinping to come. He didn't invite our Prime Minister, invited Xi Jinping to come to his inauguration. He's having a telephonic conversation with Xi Jinping, which he described as very good. His remark that it's my expectation that we'll solve many problems together and starting immediately. Then, he's saying that President Xi and I will do everything possible to make the world more peaceful and safe. Then Chinese Vice President visiting. There is no level of anxiety in China about Trump presidency, no doubt about it, because of unpredictability of Trump, what he did in his first administration, but they're also better prepared. They're more vulnerable because Chinese economy is passing through a difficult period, but they're better prepared because of steps they've taken in last few years. USA accounts for much lower proportion of Chinese exports today. Figures just came out, 2024 figures a few days ago. So you can look at the numbers. They shift towards Southeast Asia, EU, Japan, and Global South. They have made great progress on technology front, so they're less vulnerable on that account. They have, as Manoj mentioned, developed cool toolkit for sanctions very, very assiduously, and they have started deploying them against, USA, as Manoj brought out. Yan Xuethong is a leading IR scholar of China. He wrote an article in Foreign Affairs just a month ago. I'll recommend you read the article, say why China isn't scared of Trump. And he is a serious scholar. And he lays down that actually Trump presidency may open up new possibilities for China. It may be a bit of an oversale, but China is better prepared to deal with Trump 2.0 than when they got surprised in 2017. Now, there are some aspects which we need to keep an eye on, which will affect us. Unlike Biden, Trump is welcoming Chinese investment in USA. It's a big change. He would like USA to re-emerge as a manufacturing nation, and he believes that Chinese investors can be helpful. So this will be, de-risking will continue. It's a fact of life. USA is pursuing de-risking. China has been pursuing de-risking for several years. That will continue, but it will undergo change. What kind of change? I'll just. Now, Chinese hope is that the transactional approach and Trump's own self-image of master of deal-making will help them. But today, I think Trump is also a little wiser after his experience of deal of January 2020 that Manoj referred to. Chinese will offer more investment in USA, more sourcing from USA. Whether it will work or not, one doesn't know. I just finish by making a couple of other points. One, technology will remain a major arena of contestation, no doubt about it, with both sides putting in a lot of effort. Strategic contestation will remain unabated, even if there is so-called deal, because what you're looking at is battle for primacy. Trump's main objective is MAGA, make America great again. He's not going to cede primacy to China. And Xi Jinping's objective is exactly the same, make China great again. So there is a fundamental contradiction which will not go away. Here, G2, which has been, his reference that in China, USA and China can work together, do great things together, I don't think that's a possibility, because G2 can unfold best on certain multilateral issues like climate change. Trump is not interested in that. Plus, strategic positions of China and USA are far too apart. China is not going to make any substantive concessions to USA. It's willing to ride out the Trump presidency, and he may have to ride out just 2 years because we don't know what will happen after midterm elections. Final point, which was referred to by both Manoj and Alka. What is where this competition leading towards? What's the state? Is it peaceful coexistence or something different? There's a lot of debate taking place in USA today, and views range from maintaining US primacy, which is the mainstream view, to regime change. People like Mike Gallagher, Matt Pottinger, talking about regime change. I don't think Trump is interested in regime change or anything like that. He's, in a way, his view is more simple. He would like to maintain primacy. And here I have a different position compared to Alka. USA continues to have very significant edge over China in terms of comprehensive national strength. And I don't buy PPP argument. In terms of nominal dollar terms, China reached 76% of US GDP in 2021. In 2023, it had come down to 66%. Actually, it had declined. We don't have the figures for last year. So, possibility of China overtaking USA is there, but it's somewhere in distant horizon, not anytime soon.
Thank you, Ambassador, and sorry for pushing you. I think we're running against the clock. So let me straight away open this up for Q&A. The way in which I think it's ideal to do is to combine questions given the paucity of time. So can we have the first set of questions starting here?
Good evening. I am Colonel
Before you start, keep your questions brief and please direct the questions to the speakers panel.
Okay. Good evening. I am Colonel Vidur Sharma. I am currently the visiting research fellow with the ORF. My small comment is that the much of the Chinese rise since 1980s because of the US. And whatever in, China is facing the headwinds in last 10 years again because of the US. So we may say that the US restrictions may, I'll say, they propagate or they accentuate the Chinese domestic industry, but still they cannot, I'll say that compete or they cannot create such faster opportunities as they are getting the technology from the West. So I personally feel that the US should, in any case, what the Alka ma'am was highlighting is that they have to decide that if they want to have their own hegemony or I'll say the dominance in the world, they must contain the China. That's the only way. There is no question of engagement. It will help China only.
So my question is to Manoj.
Please
sir.
introduce yourself.
Yeah, Anurag from Symbiosis School of International Studies. So my question is to Manoj, sir. We all discussed about the competitive coexistence of like the narrative dominated by US, but on the other hand, we see a narrative which is Renlai Mingyun Gongtongti by China, which is community of common destiny at its various forums in Shangri-La, in Xianchen Forum. All of these talks are being dominated that yes, the global South is there and we are there to help the global South. Now, Trump is coming to power and you have a very US trade representative which is saying that 60% tariffs would be there. So would the countries of global South, like for example, Japan and Philippines, share their alliance, shift their alliance from US to the other bloc, which is dominated by China? My question is this.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you for considering my question. My name is Shresh Sharma. I'm a defense research intern at Center of Geoeconomics for the Global South. My question is directed to Ambassador Ashok Kanta. My question concerns information warfare, as there were allegations of Chinese interference in American elections via platforms like TikTok, and over privacy concerns and concerns of narrative spreading and information warfare. TikTok was banned in the US. Now another application named Red Note has taken over the scene, where the US population is embracing the application quite actively. So how is it going to play out in the future? Is US going to tackle information warfare from China rather skillfully, or what's the future of it? Thank you.
last question for this round.
Myself, Shivam, doing my master's in IR. My question is to Alka, ma'am. Ma'am, as you said, competition in economic terms and coexistence in political terms is not sustainable. So my question is, what are the structural elements that burns the bridge between the two? So that's my question.
Can we start in the reverse order, Ambassador, with your responses?
I'll respond briefly to two questions. One on information warfare. There's something which is carried out by all great nations. TikTok caused concerns in India. As you know, we very quickly banned TikTok and nearly 350 Chinese apps after developments in Eastern Ladakh. Americans have taken a long time. Finally, Supreme Court has weighed in, but President Trump is likely to have an executive order which will give more time to TikTok. I don't think Chinese have the wherewithal to significantly influence outcome of elections in the USA. They can make some difference on the margins, but very much on the margins. Likewise, Americans don't have the capacity to bring about any significant political or economic changes in China, let alone a regime change. So we are far from that situation. These are two, very powerful nations, in many ways quite autonomous, capable of looking after their interests. Now, this question about Japan, whether Japan and some others will shift their allegiance from USA to China, very unlikely. Very unlikely. I don't see any trend in that direction. If anything, actually, alliance relationship becoming stronger because of a variety of reasons. What we are witnessing that countries in the middle, Southeast Asia, for instance, ASEAN countries, they don't want to take sides. So they will try to sit it out to the maximum extent possible.
In the case of Southeast Asia, there is a lot of tripping of Chinese trade through Southeast Asia to the United States. Now that presents a dilemma to the US because if they enhance tariffs to ASEAN, in some way they will push ASEAN closer to China. That's one problem. Second point is that, I think you said about containing China. Are you talking of decoupling with? Yeah, so, the thing is that decoupling is easier said than done. 2024 trade, China exported 524 billion worth of goods to the United States. So leave aside decoupling, even if you raise tariffs, the US will have to pay. The US public. That will simply not be doable. Meaning it's everything from toys, electronics, 3D printers, UAVs. A UAV company, recently there was a story about how a UAV company in the US has been sanctioned by the Chinese and they don't know what to do. So the thing is that with that scale, this was the problem which we faced. Meaning we did try, after 2020, India tried to restrict its trade with China, but we found that the trade kept on growing. Why did it keep on growing? Because if you want to establish your own manufacturing, which the US again wants to, you need China. Because components, assemblies, sub-assemblies, everything will come from China. You want to set up an EV plant, everything will come from China. So you could theoretically do that decoupling over maybe 10, 20 years, but you cannot do it in the short term. It's not feasible. With regard to the information thing like TikTok and Red Note, see, the thing is that at the end of the day, what is it that the Chinese are gaining? Meaning, is it that if you look at TikTok and if you look at the news reports from the US, people are making, there are some 200,000 people who make a huge amount of money out of performance in TikTok. Someone puts up a recipe, someone puts up a exercise, and they've got followers and they're making money out of that thing. So what is it that the Chinese will gain? Chinese, what they will gain is huge amounts of data, which they can use for their models, for their AI models. That is true. But there are other ways, in the sense, I'm not so sure that beyond that anyone is, because if the US Congress and everyone is saying that TikTok is very bad, and suddenly you have the US president-elect saying, I'm willing to extend the thing, there's some contradiction there, there's some issue there. I just want to respond.
So, yeah, I'll just, add to that in the sense that to put the argument that because of the Americans, the Chinese came to where they are and now, the Americans should stop it. It's a very simplistic way of looking, because why does America shift to China in the late 70s? Of course, China opened up, but that relates also to the structural changes that come about. What is happening since the 70s is this massive transfer of capital from the West to Asia. And that had to do with rising costs of labor, increasing costs of production. Huge amounts come in, and China opens its doors at a very fortuitous moment, and they made millions of Americans very, very rich, to the extent that today there is a sizable lobby which does not want this decoupling. So it's not so simple to now, because over the last 30, 40 years, the global value chains, something is coming out from somewhere, being assembled somewhere, produced somewhere, marketed somewhere, and then shipped from some. That's what we have found, that it's not so easy to. So the structural shift out here is that with this transfer of capital that you come and China's rise, China is able to now play a role in world affairs, which has, on the basis of its huge resources. Today, so in the 70s, the Japanese wanted to set up an Asian development bank, the equivalent of that, and the Americans completely nixed it. So the Japanese had no option but to listen to what the Americans told them. Today, the Chinese have set up a bank, and you see the structural change that I'm talking about is that now you have a larger number of Asian players, Asian developing countries, who are also in this game of development and who are looking at this as an opportunity. So ultimately, the location of any particular country in the world order and its ability to influence economic, political, strategic decisions is what the structural change transformation is all about. And here we can easily see that China's emergence as a major player in Asia, and of course, now it's trying to take a leading role as far as developing world is concerned, really is located in that.
We have about 5 minutes for a quick second round. So starting with you, sir.
Thanks. I'm Amit Gupta. I'm an industry leader, business leader. My compliments to all the panelists for their comprehensive presentation. My question is directed to, or my request is directed to Ambassador Ashok Kanta, sir. I would like to request you to please repeat the name of the article that you have mentioned. China is not scared of US. One. Second, before I ask this question, I would like to mention that I have business interests both with China as well as US. So under the given circumstances, how and what do you foresee for India? That is, for me, it is a very pertinent question. The tussle, whatever is happening, what it brings to India, what challenges do you foresee in the near future for us? Thank you.
Georgios Kostakos from the Foundation for Global Governance Sustainability, based in Belgium, but working with the UN before. For me, there are the narratives, the American narrative, the Chinese narrative. Why should we be playing along and comparing those instead of creating a third narrative, which is beyond sitting out the problem to survive the elephant's battle? When, for example, you talk about predominance of the US, how long can it be continue when per capita there are so many more Chinese? So the US can have a perfect life per capita, and still China can be a bigger economic power in aggregate. So, I mean, it's like comparing what has happened before India and Britain, the former colonial power, 70 million people and 1.5 billion. All this is also up to us to change the narrative and demand from these two superpowers responsible behavior because everybody is influenced. And I think this sitting out has to become a more proactive, not exactly on alignment, but do you see that as imposing some kind of rules to these interactions of the great powers? Thank you.
Yeah, my question is directed to Alka ma'am. So, like under Trump, can we see US sticking to its climate action goals, or contrary to that, can we see something like CBAM or climate tax implemented by the US? And considering the increasing demand of power and supply in the global south. So, thank you.
Thank you. My question is for Dr. Joshi and Professor Alka Acharya. This is regarding the great power competition and the impact on the export controls. So what we are seeing is the states are not really playing by the universal rules, but they are coming up with country-specific, export controls in this case. So how is it going to impact the supply chains and Dr. Joshi highlighted the UAV and the components, how is it going to impact the US-China technology come military competition? Thank you.
So, you want to start? But I'll go in last.
No, the first question about the article. This article was in Foreign Affairs Journal. This was around 20th December. If you like, I can. Before I leave, I'll pass on the link to you. Now, he's a very well-known scholar, Yan Xuetong, from Tsinghua University, which is one of the two top universities of China. Coming to what are the challenges and opportunities for India in the present scenario, it's a truism to say that in a period of flux, where changes are taking place we are unable to fathom. For instance, while decoupling is not at all possible, given nature of interconnectedness among countries, deglobalization not possible, but globalization being reimagined. We are moving towards a fractured marketplace where, in certain high technology areas, there will be parallel markets emerging. It's already happened in 5G telephony, for instance, where China, USA could not prevent China from dominating large segments of global telecommunication market. Same thing will happen in artificial intelligence. A whole lot of areas will happen. So how do we, then global value chains are being restructured in a major way. One realization after COVID conflict, pandemic, was that it's not enough to have efficient supply chain. You must have resilient supply chain. Dependence on one country is not healthy as part of supply chain or global value chain. So that's being reimagined. This opens up new opportunities for India. But how US-China relations will develop under Trump, there's a lot of uncertainty. So strategic convergence between India and USA vis-a-vis China, again, it's uncertain. We cannot be very sure about it. HR violations in China, it's not for me to comment on how US should respond. It's for them to respond. Only thing I would like to point out, that a lot of bad things are happening in China, but a lot of bad things are happening elsewhere also. And USA is the major enabler of those bad things, like what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in Syria. Syria, we don't even pay attention. It's being bombed by 3 countries, USA, Israel, and Turkey, and no one is bothered about it. So I think that there is a problem of double standards there. A US preeminence, whether we shut out, no, actually we are not comfortable with the hegemony of any country. That's why India keeps talking about multipolar Asia to begin with, because that affects us more directly, and multipolar world. So We would not like USA to be replaced by China as the hegemon. Likewise, we are not comfortable with US hegemony either. We would like to have our own space.
So if we go back to Trump '01, you recall he had produced a small book which was America Great or something like that in just in 2016 or so, in which he made this bizarre kind of a statement that this whole climate business was a huge conspiracy which the Chinese had floated and there's nothing to it. Now, then they've withdrawn out of Paris. So the whole issue is, to what extent will this become some kind of a pressure point in multilateral fora? I mean, the point is the US can walk out and look at the impact on the rest of the world. And it is building up. I was reading some studies which showed that the voices from the developing world are becoming increasingly now angry about this disdain for their their rights to clean and so I have a feeling that this is something, a work in progress. Maybe there may be some pressure that is put on or maybe it could be part of some kind of transaction, some kind of a bargain with the Chinese, so we never know. But clearly the Americans have taken an untenable position and they're going to get increasingly isolated because the environment is, so I think we need to see how it evolves. And about the business of export controls and all, see, under the WTO, countries have to negotiate these things bilaterally. So what happens is that when export tariffs are imposed on certain kind of exports, it is about, that's why the US and the Chinese have to sit down and talk about it directly. But what happens with these increases, that then the costs escalate and then they fall on hapless people who have nothing to do with this game. So cost of something goes up, then some inputs go up, the whole cost of the product goes up, and that then escalates. So I think again it has to do with the way in which countries negotiate this in the best interests of everybody.
I'll just address one or two points. One is the question of the Indian challenges and opportunities. This July, the economic survey for the first time pointed out that maybe we should change our China orientation. They said we need either to be in Chinese supply chains or we need investment in technology from China. This is what the economic survey said. And after that, the Niti Aayog chairman also got into the picture and sort of endorsed that position. See, the point, what I was trying to make, that the Chinese are so big in manufacturing. They are today producing 30 to 35% of the world manufacturing product. That without China, your plans won't succeed. Meaning, if you need a component, if you want to set up a factory, you need Chinese experts. You want to set up Apple, for example, in the papers that has just come out, that Chinese are not allowing Apple engineers to come to India because it will encourage Indian industry. So the Chinese have also ways of hitting back at us. The economic survey, the Niti Aayog chairman also made another point, which is very important for our plans. He said we should have been members of RCEP. You see, by staying out of RCEP, by saying that China will dominate out there, what we've done is we have cut ourselves off from the entire Southeast Asian economic system, Southeast Asia and that whole Indo-Pacific area. So the point is that, and this is linked to what Rahul said about, the question of export controls. Do export controls work? Meaning there were export controls against us in our nuclear program, but we still went and made nuclear weapons. If you are strategically driven, you will steal technology, you will buy technology, you will do anything to get that technology. And here in this particular case, there's one big difference. That is that in the last 30 years, Chinese have generated sufficient momentum in their technology sector, whereby which simply cutting them off doesn't take you anywhere. Because as I concluded with my thing, that it can actually encourage China to spur Chinese growth. The possibility of and so that growth will be out of your control. If you are interlinked with China, you're together with them. If you're making some component, they're making some component. But if it's all Chinese affair, then you will simply have to buy. You'll simply have to buy. So what I'm trying to say is that this export control business is you have to very carefully look at it. In AI, I'm specifically talking of AI. There has been a spurt of Chinese growth in the last 2 years in the AI sector because of the restrictions that were placed on them.
Thank you, sir. I'm afraid we don't have time for another round. As the time will tell you, that my inability to control the timing is purely the interest, is telling of the interest on the topic. I think that's the complexity of US-China relations will continue, and I think it's going to further intensify with Trump in office. What are the curves around which it swings more and swings less? We'll have to see as in the next 4 years, the US-China competition unfolds under Trump. Thank you all for being here.